All right, so in this section, you're going to have to start figuring out a story that you're going to use for your documentary part of this workshop because, as we've said, the documentary is going to be the form, the mold that we're going to work in to help us understand how to put a story together and use some of the more advanced techniques. So that being said, we got to ask ourselves a simple question. How do you pick a good story to film versus a bad story? Because nobody wants to end up filming and spending a lot of time on a bad story. You want to make sure you have a good story, something interesting to do. So there's a handful of criteria that we're going to suggest that you use when you pick out a story. So let's talk about a few of those things. But then let's also talk a little bit about what exactly is a documentary when we say documentary. So really what we need to begin with is a documentary is a film that is designed around a moment of time or an event in reality itself. So basically it's looking at reality, the world around us, and saying at some point this event occurred or this moment occurred and something about that is interesting. And the end goal is either to A, provide a historical account of this exists, this just is, it's all information, here it is, or it's a documentary designed to give you a bunch of information for the purpose of changing the way you behave, maybe change the way you think, something like that. So you can have a documentary that does either of those things, but the goal is to look at reality and find a moment or an event of something that really happened. And so the documentary goes to document that event or thing that occurred and the people involved and all that kind of stuff. Now, a documentary usually still focuses on the story elements that we've been discussing, which is, well, I'm writing this backwards, but that'll be okay. You have your setup at the beginning, then you have conflict, and at the end you have resolution. Now, most of the time, a documentary film will pick an event. It will say, here's the setup of the event. This is what was going on that day. It was really pretty. It was 60 degrees. And then suddenly something happens. There's a conflict of some sort. And then at the end, you have resolution. You know, after all the horrific events occurred, it was okay. This happened. And here's the lesson that was learned in the film. A lot of times, a documentary will focus on that. Now, sometimes documentaries will just seek to document something going on. It doesn't really have setup, conflict, or resolution. It's just showing you pure information. And those are what we call just historical kind of documentaries, where they're just not historical in the sense of history events, but historical in the sense of it's a record of something that is. And so you have both of those things, but we're going to focus on the first one, where you have a documentary filming an event of some kind involving setup, conflict, and resolution. So how do you pick out a story to do that? How do you go about it? So we're going to give you a few things that we want you to keep in mind. The first is think about, is this thing interesting? Is it interesting? Is this moment, is this event, is it interesting to you? Because if it's not interesting to you, chances are it's not going to be interesting to us. If you're going to spend a lot of time filming something, you don't want to film something that you find boring, and we don't want to actually watch a film that's boring. So if it's boring to you, chances are it's going to be boring to us. So you need to ask yourself, is this thing interesting to you? And hopefully you'll find things that are, stories that sound really interesting to you. But make sure, just because they're interesting to you, you want to make sure that it's not too specific. And what I mean by too specific is you might like a lot of, small niche kind of things. You might have some very particular hobbies that really interest you, but that the general, broad spectrum audience might not know anything about that and might not find that interesting at all. And so you need to make sure that the thing that you choose is interesting to you, but also has a broader interest in the community around you, the people that are going to be watching the film. And so a good way to look at this is to say, okay, if you find it interesting, would other people find it interesting as well? And of those other people, is it a broad other people or is it a very narrow other people? For example, when we picked Mindy Lou Pies, when we decided to film Mindy Lou Pies, we looked at it from the first of all, the perspective of it's about pies. It's people that make pies. We love pies. Fried pies are fantastic. And we had no idea how they were made. So we found that really interesting. And we thought, you know what? I bet other people would like to know how pies are made. But also we looked at the family family who was doing Mindy Lou pies, and we looked at them and said, hey, their story is all about faith and in the pie business. And we thought, that's really interesting. A lot of people out there like stories about faith. A lot of people out there eat pies. If you put them together, you're probably going to end up with a product that a lot of people like to see. So it's interesting, but it's not too specific where only a handful of people are gonna like that. The next thing you want to really consider is accessibility. Is it accessible? If you're going to choose a story that you're going to document, you got to make sure that you can get to the people involved. You're going to need to interview them, so make sure that they're accessible. You need to get to the locations where things occurred and film B-roll there. And so, can you get there? While it'd be great to film a documentary in the White House, I guarantee you there's a ton of red tape and nearly impossible to do. So you don't want to pick something that's out of your reach. Try not to pick something that happened in the 1500s, because it's going to be really hard to document something. Try to stick with things that are close. Family, friends, events that occur that you're near to, things that are accessible to you, locations that are accessible, people that will let you come film them. Think about those kinds of things. The next thing we like to talk about, we call it truth. You could even put it as a lesson up here. Is there a truth statement in your film? Is there some sort of lesson that's learned? Everything was one way, an event occurred, there was some conflict, but people learned a lesson and it reflects a universal truth. If it has that in the film, that's a really strong chord. It's a good foundation for a film, and so you can kind of go about proving the lesson. And so people like stories where they start one way and they see a lesson is learned over time. That's a great thing. So see if the story that you're looking at has a truth or a lesson involved. And then it's really good to think about a takeaway at the end. And by takeaway, I mean you should have an idea from hearing the story. Okay, if you filmed the story, what do you want the audience to take away when the film is done? What is it you want them to leave feeling? What do you want them to change about their behavior? What's the lesson that you want the audience to also learn and maybe start doing things differently? You need to think about, what do you want them to be feeling when they walk away from seeing your film? So if it's interesting to you, but it's not too specific, if it's accessible to you, if there's some form of lesson learned through the events, if there's a strong takeaway where you think people will walk away thinking a good thing, then that's probably a better story than something that doesn't have those things. So here at Lumen Deo, we get asked all the time, how do we pick stories? Because there might be a lot of stories that have all these elements in them, and people will give them to us, but we still have to select a story. And that's a really good thing about filmmaking. That's one of the great things that you have to get good at as a director, as a filmmaker, is being able to figure out what stories are good versus what stories might be good but not the greatest ones to film. You have to be able to sort through it, sift through it, and figure out which ones are good. So there's a few things we do at Lumen Deo that really help us narrow down the stories that we do. So I want to give you a few of those as well. First, we look at this. If it has all of this, then that's kind of stage one. We want to make sure that's stage one. And then we do what we call is a sit down. And this is basically exactly like it sounds. We go and we sit down with the people that are involved and we ask lots and lots of questions. We usually take a notepad, we write a lot of notes down, and basically what we're doing is we want to hear the story from the mouths of the people involved. We want to hear it, we want as much detail as we can, and sometimes we'll sit down and we'll get the whole thing in 30 minutes. Sometimes it'll take 4 hours. We don't really care how long it takes. We want to have a huge, broad understanding of the story with all the details in place, and we want to hear it from the people involved so we have that perspective. So that's the first thing that we do. Then what we do is we sit down and we analyze it. We start looking at the broad story that we just heard with all the details, and we analyze it looking for story structure. We say, okay, how did they say their setup was? Was that a strong setup? Was it an interesting setup? What's the conflict? Was it really interesting conflict? Did it look really dire? Did it look difficult and hard? And if it did, that's really interesting. And as the story goes, do they just quickly deal with the conflict? Does it take a lot of time? Is there a struggle? Is there a journey involved? If there's a struggle or journey involved, then we're really interested at this point. And then what's the resolution from the story that they gave us? Is there a resolution? Did they learn a lesson? Did something about their life change because of this thing? And if all of that is there, if we've sat down, heard it all, and we've analyzed it and found a solid story structure within the story, well then that is great. Then we're really on to something. And so now we've really narrowed it down. And so now we do two little things that kind of practice whether or not the story, kind of test the audience, if you want to call it like that. And the first thing that we do is called log lines. And a logline is just a one-sentence description of the film as a whole. If you were to explain the film that you're going to make in one sentence, that is what you would call a logline. And a logline will usually have a setup, conflict, and resolution all within one sentence. And so to kind of help us with this, we're going to do one more video right after this one that kind of talks about loglines in a little more detail. But then after the logline, after we have our one sentence, we go around, we talk to people. We say, hey, let me tell you this logline to this film we're working on. And we see, are the people that hear our logline, are they interested in the film? Do they say things like, wow, that sounds really interesting. I would watch something like that. If they say something like that, then you probably have a good story on your hands, and that might be a good thing. But after that, what we do is we write our logline, and after that, what we do is we write a pitch. And when we refer to a pitch, there's a lot of options that you can look at when you're talking about a pitch, but what we look at is maybe one paragraph. It's not a logline. A logline is one sentence, but a pitch, you have like a whole paragraph to work with. You kind of add some more details, really kind of paint a little bit better picture than the logline gives you. And so then from the pitch, you go around and say, hey, let me pitch you this idea that we're going to do. And then you stay your paragraph. You've already written and everything. This is commonly referred to in Hollywood because the idea would be you would get on an elevator with the producer and you have 1 minute between the door closing and the door opening on the next floor where everybody gets off and leaves. And so you have 1 minute to pitch the story to somebody. So what you're doing when you write a pitch is exactly that. You're pitching the story and you're going to see, do people like it when you tell them this? When you say, hey, let me pitch you this idea. We're about to do a film. It's about this. And then you pitch your paragraph. And if it's good, if you get a lot of good response from people, if people say, yeah, I'd watch something like that, well, then that's probably a good story. So all that being said, let's talk a little more about log lines.